right. Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Fuller, a researcher at Columbia University, and I'll be talking about quality improvement to come, improving care with machine learning models. Now, the first question people tend to ask is, why machine learning? And I find the metaphor of the strings to be useful. The clinical environment is chaotic. Multidisciplinary teams collaborating on individual cases, and the effects of therapies and medications not only affect the patient, but other therapies and medications. And therefore, we need a tool to deconstruct the influence of each variable, to untangle the clinical knot. And descriptive ML is that tool. Once the effect of these variables have been quantified and cataloged, they can be combined to form predictive systems, such as complex patient monitoring software. Unlike linear regression and other more simple statistical models, deep neural networks can theoretically approximate any continuous function, regardless of dependence between variables. And as crazy as that sounds, it's true. With enough data, data density, and proper model complexity, any relationship between variables can be modeled, such as between all the variables in ECMO. And the first step of untangling that clinical knot is data collection. When we work on ECMO, we collect perfusion data, laboratory values, their vital signs, and ventilator settings. Perfusion data includes things like the circuit flow, the sweep gas, delta pressure across the membrane lung. And then using machine learning, we're able to decompose the individual importance of each variable we track. And by importance, we mean how much the value affects the chance of successful decannulation. A high value, such as in sweep flow normalized to BMI, indicates that controlling this factor is one of the most important in determining a positive outcome. This decomposition step is done via SHAP values, and this concept, devised by Nobel laureate Lloyd Shapley, performs that untwist maneuver in the rope metaphor, decoupling the effects of each variable from each other. Not only can we measure the average weight, but we can actually break it down by percentage of time on ECMO. Now, this may not seem entirely fair. A clinician doesn't know when they're only 50% done with the run, but it does allow us to figure out which variables are important earlier in the run and which are more important later in the run. Compared to sweep flow normalized to BMI, the reigning champion, controlling SVO2 in the earlier stages seems to have greater sway over the outcome. We can also sanity check ourselves if this sounds crazy by simply looking at the median variable values and how they change over time. As shown in the right of the screen, the value for sweep gas normalized to BMI between patients that were successful in the blue and those that were unsuccessful in the orange slowly becomes more divergent as ECMO concludes. And the greater this discrepancy grows, the more valuable the variable becomes. And this is reflected in its increasing SHAP value. In addition to relative importance, we can also break it down by how the variable value affects the outcome. I usually like to have people guess, but this is a quick presentation. This is the SHAP breakdown for survivors of the Titanic. And you can notice that having a lower class, such as in first or second, is correlated with a positive impact on survival, whereas a higher class value, such as third or fourth, is correlated with a lower chance of survival. Having a lower age is also better for you as opposed to having a higher age, as is having a higher gender, indicated by 1, meaning female. And so think about this. A mathematical function with no clinical reasoning or rules of thumb can correctly rank and quantify the importance of any measurement, be it a lab value, a sweep rate, or a medication dose. And by expanding this, both in number of patients and in number of variables, a ranked order of therapies and medications quantified by their individual effect on outcome can be created. Now, while this can only demonstrate correlation, new findings can be further studied prospectively, yielding new insights into ECMO care. Now, I didn't even get a chance to touch on predictive ML, but I love talking about this kind of stuff, so feel free to shoot me an email. Thank you all for listening to the presentation.
Thank you. I would like to thank the organizers of the meeting for inviting me to share some of our experience today, and thank all of you for your attention this morning. You'll be happy to know that during my talk, you'll have plenty of time to actually think about what Josh just told you. We have many conversations at Columbia about how to use the data best, and we can't thank him enough for the work he does to help us. So I have no financial disclosures. Some of the things I will talk to you about today we do use on a daily basis. But when we leverage data management for our sickest patients, I like to think about this in two pretty generally broad buckets, and that's historical data and real or live data. And when we think about that, each of these things has value. And one of the things I like to do is I like to think about the automotive industry. If we think about historical data, we know things like we know that if you drive drunk, your odds of getting in a crash are tripled. Or if we're texting and driving, we have a 23-time more likely incident to get into an accident. Or if we're tired when we're driving, our reaction rate is slowed significantly. So then we use this historical data, and we can do reports around this, and we can generally develop policies, procedures, and educational mechanisms to try to help reduce driving fatalities, right? So what about live data or real-time data? How do we use that to help us? And if you think about it in the automotive industry, think about our cars, right? We have things like blind spot monitoring, rear cross-track, lane departure alerts assist in driving, pedestrian alerts, auto braking. We even have lasers that when our eyes leave the road when we get drowsy, it can actually alert us to what's going on. So in this instance, we're taking real-time data and we're giving it back to the operator or the driver at the time it's happening to help them do a better job staying out of an accident and arriving safely. So what does that look like for us in ECMO? Well, we're sure that there's no shortage at this meeting and at any meeting of the importance of using historical data, right? We have tons of publications out there on how we can use this data to help us with policies and procedures and designing ECMO programs where we can get patients through safely. Well, what does that look like, though, when we're talking about real-time data? And how can we use that live or real-time data analysis to help our clinicians at the bedside? And when I tell you this whole area is really just at the tip of the iceberg here, there's so many ways that we yet have to develop how we can use this data to help our clinicians do a better job taking care of folks while it's happening. And I'm just going to briefly go through a couple of examples of what we use every day because this is a relatively short talk. Now, most of what we learned and brought into the ECMO arena, we've learned from the operating room. And some of the things I'll discuss today very briefly are how we use some of these tools of the trade to help us do a better job taking care of ECMO folks. Things like best practice alarms and alerts and critical care scoring and dashboards and collaborative sharing. How we take these notifications and how we notify our clinicians in a whole host of mechanisms. And then one of my favorites, clinical guidance to help our teams. And then the interactive graphic user interface, which seems to get better day by day. So the first one is best practice alarms. So what best practice alarms are? These are pop-up alerts that happen at the bedside to tell us that something's moving in a range that we're uncomfortable with. So in this particular instance, we get a pop-up that says, hey, Jimmy, your blood pressure's been below 60 for more than 60 seconds. You should probably address this. And these alarms stay on the screen until we address them so we can help take care of folks in a better fashion. Now, the next one takes it one step further, and that's called critical care scoring. And what critical care scoring does, it allows us to take several physiologic parameters and put them together to create an alarm. Now, most of you are probably familiar with this with Apache scores, right? Apache scores are used in trauma medicine and emergency medicine to help dictate the direction a patient may be moving in and what the proper clinical course may be to improve outcomes. Now, this is a little bit different for us because this is open architecture. So what we do here is we take several physiologic parameters, we assign a score to them, and then we can set alarms and alerts based on those scores. So in this particular picture, you'll see there's 5 different classifications or critical care scores. When those scores are in a range that's safe, they show up green. When they move into a warning area, they show up yellow. And when they're in an alarm state, they show up red. So in this particular case, red means we probably need immediate attention. And in this particular example, the one that's red is our renal system. So we can actually click on that red, and it brings up all of those parameters that make up that score. So it could be things like renal perfusion, urine output, perfusion pressure, creatinine, BUN. So all of these parameters can be brought in from different systems, and the computer analyzes this data second to second and feeds it back to us at the bedside as well as remotely so we can see what's going on. So if you look at the top right there, you'll notice that's a dashboard that basically we can see anywhere in the world. So as long as we have internet access, we can log into our system through a VPN. I've been doing it all weekend here on my phone. I can see every ECMO patient in the hospital, all of their parameters, whether it's vital parameters, ECMO perfusion parameters, blood gases, labs, pressure traces. I can see everything remotely. And we can also see critical care scores. So you'll see, again, the green, yellow, and red to let us know that we're in alarm states and we should probably be addressing this to take care of folks. Now, one of the newer things that we've used from a collaborative standpoint are dashboards and what we call the Vitals app. If you look at the top right of the screen here, that's the dashboard that's in our operating room every day. So that allows everybody in the room to see what's going on during the entire bypass run. So we can, our anesthesiologists, our surgeons, PAs, nurses, perfusionists, everybody in the room can see what's going on second to second. It's grafted on that, and that's on a big screen in the back of the room. You'll notice the orange boxes when things move outside of a range. That alerts us to things that are going in a direction we're uncomfortable with, and it helps everybody participate to make that better. Now, the big one you see on the bottom is a newer version of that called the Vitals app. And in this particular case, it's a depiction of our oxygenator performance. I guess I probably have to turn around a little because I don't remember what I put up there. Sorry about that. Oh, so this one has PO2, PCO2, our VO2, or oxygen consumption on this particular case, our FiO2 sweep, and delta pressure. So by looking at these parameters and then looking at them over time, we can actually predict when things are moving in a direction that we're uncomfortable with. We can also zoom in on these parameters. We can scroll over any time point throughout the entire run and see what the exact parameters are during that time point. Now, this is one that we've just embarked on, and this is our coagulation. So this is our coagulation for the run. So in this particular case, we have ACT, anti-10A, PTT, D-dimers, and delta pressure shown here. So from this Vitals app, you can see over the course of this run, our delta pressure is going up, as are our D-dimers. Our ACT, our PTT, and our anti-10A are all falling. So this is certainly a thrombotic issue here, and it's probably coupled with some destruction of blood cells as D-dimers rise. So we know that we're moving into a situation where we're going to thrombose this oxygenator, and we can react to adverse events actually before they happen. So before the oxygenator clots off, we know what's coming, and we can intervene earlier. So a lot more work in this area. We also use a whole host of ways to notify clinicians about what's going on. So you can see here on the left-hand side, this is actually our ECMO dashboard. These are all of our ECMOs that are taking place at multiple locations all over the hospital. We have gauge bars there that show us all of the parameters, and we can gauge whatever we want. We can see our critical care scores up there. We can get this on our phone, our computer. There's a whole host of ways we can be notified when things move outside a range. You'll notice they show up in orange, so we get a quick visual alert when things are moving where we're not comfortable. Now, we can take this one step further. We can actually have the computer send us texts right to our phones. So the computer sends me a text that says, hey, Jimmy, Mrs. Smith's CVP just went up by 15 millimeters of mercury, her blood pressure dropped by 20 millimeters of mercury, and her heart rate changed by 10%. This is a tamponade physiology. You should probably report to the bedside. And often we can get these alerts before the bedside caregivers even know what's going on. So there's some real cool ways that we use this data live to help us every day. This is probably one of my favorites. This is some of the clinical guidance that we use. So you'll notice here we have a pop-up, and it just says, hey, the cerebral saturation's low. Well, for me, they asked Einstein his phone number. He went to the phone book and looked it up, and they said, you don't know your own phone number? And he said, a smart man knows where to find information, not how to store it. So this is one way that we use live data to help our clinicians while things are going on. So instead of snoozing this alarm, I can hit the checklist button, and I can bring up a checklist that helps guide our clinicians as to what's going on. Now, the really neat thing about this is we can actually make this very specific to the case at hand. So, for low cerebral saturations, of course, we do things on the right, like rule out mechanical obstruction, adjust the head, increase the cardiac output, increase the PaCO2 if it's less than 35. We can transfuse cells. We can reduce oxygen demand. We can decrease the blood temperature. But what about on ECMO? So then we have an ECMO-specific checklist that also pops up that says we should confirm where that saturation probe is placed on the head. We should access the patient configuration. In this case, it's a VA FEM-FEM. We should assess the patient for pulsatility, determine the mixing cloud point, right? North-south, harlequin, differential hypoxemia, whatever you want to call it. The point at which the ECMO output meets the native output. Increase blood flow rate, increase ventilator settings, assess the native output with a right radial gas, consider an additional infusion cannula up top. So we're helping our clinicians, as these things are happening, to do a better job troubleshooting and taking care of folks. So the graphic user interface, this is something new. This is our 12-inch Elite that you see here. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time because a very short talk, but this allows us to basically display as much or as little as we want on the screen. It lets bedside caregivers identify very quickly what's going on. We can bring in third-party devices here, so it could be cerebral oximeters, or it could be infusion pumps, or it can be ventilators. We can set alarms and alerts with those. We can couple those alarms and alerts so that they're meaningful. We can reduce alarm fatigue, so we don't have alarms going off all the time at the bedside. But if 3 alarms are coupled together and those all announce, that's not a false alarm, right? We want to know about that. So this allows us to take care of folks in a much better manner. If you look here, you'll also notice that you can see in the middle of the screen the pump flow, the RPMs. The little depiction there is, we used to call it Cannula Man, now it's called Cannula Locator. If you look on the left side, you see those buttons that look like apps on your phone? That's because they're apps on your ECMO. So this is an app-based system. So you can open apps at different points throughout the patient's care that can help you to guide your next action. We've also adopted on this new graphic interface the ELSO master treaty nomenclature to identify ECMO configurations. So you'll notice in this example, patient's cannulated. It's a VA cannulation with a 23 French in the femoral vein, a 19 French in the femoral artery, and a distal size 7. So that allows us to easily identify where those cannulas are, show it in a pictorial form for our bedside caregivers. We can also put our critical care scores on the monitor for those that are a little bit more in tune and want to get a little more in depth. If it looks too confusing on the screen, we can take off as much as we want as well. One of the new things we're embarking on, and I'll wrap up here, is the ELSO registry, where the computer will actually auto-populate much of the ELSO registry information for us without needing too much hands-on. So just to wrap up here in summary, real-time data acquisition helps clinicians perform better, and of course that equates into better patient care. We use things like predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics, and we can avoid adverse patient events before they happen. But we also shouldn't dispel the importance of historical reporting, right? We know that, we learn from missed events. It helps us to improve consistency of care, improve compliance, do meaningful QA and QI programs, as well as improve efficiency. This graph you see here is one of the things we use all the time. This is an oxygenator that's thrombosing. The flow begins to drop off. The pressure, delta pressure across the oxygenator increases. We change out oxygenators now before oxygenators thrombose off and patients arrest. So we can avoid the adverse events before they happen, and we can plan for them accordingly. So what's next? Well, certainly there'll be new ways to use this continuous data. Like I said, we're at the beginning of the iceberg here. Guys like Josh are going to help us with predictive analytics and machine learning, maybe using things like the Harvey simulator. We heard Dr. Burkhoff talk about that, where we can simulate what will happen before we try something out on an ECMO patient. So maybe we can predict how things will go actually before we try out the intervention. Certainly automation, we already now use automated CO2 and PCO2 regulation. The computer can basically keep the sweep and the FiO2 at whatever it needs to get us what PO2 and PCO2 we want. For instance, patients that are hypercapnic, we could say, well, we don't want to bring the CO2 from 120 to 30 on the first day, so over the next 4 days, we'd like to do it in consistent increments to bring that down. So we have a whole host of ways where the computer can assist us and do a better job taking care of folks. We're certainly excited about some of the new heart-lung technology, disposable technology, and like I said, the ELSO app that we're just embarking on. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your attention, and I think we're going to do questions at the end. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shelley DeFort. I'm a data scientist at Battelle Memorial Institute, and we've been working with Boston Children's Hospital for about 2 years to try to figure out how we can make use of the experience and the wisdom in complex historical EHR data to iteratively improve complex treatment strategies. So there's 3 things that I would like you to take away from this. The first is that all decisions are based on models. Human decisions are based on models. And we need more data-driven models. So how we make a decision about what kind of model we use, whether it's based just on human judgment or based on data, is based on where we think the information is. And then also that data-driven models must be held to the same standard as human-driven models. So, right, if you go to the store and you're trying to figure out what kind of peanut butter to choose, right, you are building a model. Maybe you loved Jif when you were a kid. Maybe a crunchy peanut butter brings you pleasure. Maybe someone in your family likes creamy peanut butter, right? So you're selecting variables, and then you're weighting them, and then you're making a decision, right? So we are always doing this, and it's the same thing with machine learning models. It's just we introduce the machine when things get too complicated, essentially, for the human mind. So we have a couple of different kinds of models too. Right, so something that I think about a lot, and I'm coming to you as a data scientist and also as a skeptic in terms of using AI for clinical applications. And I think you should be skeptical too, and I'm expecting you to be skeptical. I think you should have to be convinced that AI is a good idea. So AI researchers are typically concerned with this sort of observations to outcome model. So right, we take inputs and then we predict an outcome, and we are really not concerned about what happens in between. Like, we're not concerned about whether our input variables are even relevant to the outcome as long as it makes a good prediction, and we're concerned about those metrics. But once we start talking about using AI to inform decisions, we have to think about the path in between our inputs and our outputs. And this is kind of a gap in AI research. And is something that we really need to think about. So a risk model would be an example of something where we are just predicting an outcome, and a risk model is going to tell us there is risk, but it's not going to tell us how to respond to that risk. And typically, the statistical method that you would use to kind of inform a treatment decision would be causal inference. But causal inference, it has its limitations and is a fairly simple statistical method. So as things get more complicated, we can't always easily apply that. But we do want to kind of, I think, approach AI when we're talking about how we use it to make better decisions. We do want to approach it from the same perspective as why you would use causal inference, which is we want to get as close as possible to a randomized controlled trial. But there's an understanding, right, that we can't, when we have multiple treatment decisions, we can't always design those experiments easily. They're not always available or published. And so if we're using observational data, we just want to do everything we can to be aware of trying to replicate a randomized control trial. So, again, in a lot of cases, a human being can take the inputs, or we can sort of use a statistical model combined with expert knowledge to kind of gather the variables that we think are most important and then statistically analyze them to figure out which are most important. There kind of comes a point, and especially when you're dealing with EHR data, where it is simply beyond a human being to aggregate that data or to figure out what's important. And the argument I kind of want to make is that we can't get around the requirement for machine learning if we think the information is stored in the complexity of the EHR data. So, right, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll go to the EHR data and we'll say, like, I'm not comfortable using AI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my expert knowledge, and I'm going to select the variables that I think are most important, and then I'm going to use usually some kind of heuristics to aggregate them. I'm going to take an average of these values, or right, because it's so complicated and so missized. Maybe this patient, we didn't take these measurements, or this value isn't present. And so there's a lot of, when we want to go in, when we feel more comfortable using our human judgment on the data, we a lot of times have to go in and we are making judgment calls on how we simplify that data that are biased and that speak to sort of our desire for simplicity. So if we think that the information that we need is stored in this complexity. So I love the idea of walking a path and coming to forks in the road and making decisions, because this sort of navigation through space is really similar to how we would navigate treatment decisions. We come to points, we collect information about our state and the state of the patient, and then we make a decision. And the common method that we would use from an AI perspective is reinforcement learning. And it's the same when we train an AI to navigate through a game and to play that game. We're actually kind of using the same method when we take historical medical data to try to figure out what the best treatment options are. Now, typically when you train an AI to navigate through a game, you are not concerned about confounding variables. And we need to be concerned about that, because if we're going to use it to make choices, then we should care about whether our treatment really made a difference and how much of a difference it made if we're going to select among several treatments. So kind of the path that I see from starting from these risk models, many of which are already in place. So you have a handful of variables that you found to be most important. You're going to predict an outcome. It's going to it might read from EHR data in real time. It's going to send an alert. But again, this way of using ML is not going to tell you how to respond to that alert. So the next step is going to be data collection. So you're going to add information about an intervention or one that you've identified in your EHR data. And you're just going to watch the variability in the interventions, the related observations, and then the outcome. So that's what we've tried to do with the ECMO data over years is we have different strategies that are employed. They've changed over time. So different clinicians have different strategies. And so we have that variability. So we can start to speculate about what might be, and by speculate, I mean through machine learning, start to speculate about what the best treatment path is. And then finally, when you've collected this data, your output isn't the outcome anymore. Your output is actually the intervention. So the output is actually what kind of choice should you make, what kind of treatment policy or strategy should you develop depending on the state of the patient. And the actual in-between is actually, we have models that are sort of predicting the outcome to try to inform those choices. So I think a really important gap between AI researchers and clinical AI is these ethical standards. And so I think this is just a really important area where we need more research and we need to think about it and we need to hold our data scientists to these standards. So we need to make sure that our AI are asking the right questions. So, you might say, ask your AI, please select the right patients for this treatment. Please select the patients that will have the best outcome for this treatment, right? If you give an AI that problem, it is going to select the healthiest patients because that's what you've asked it to do, right? So it's not making decisions for the right reasons. And the other thing I think we need to think about is systemic bias in our population data from historical data. So we need to make sure that we're aware of it and that we're adjusting for it so we don't continue to compound it. And then transparency as well. So this is a really important part of building trust for AI and clinicians. Thank you.
Okay, so we've just heard some amazing applications of AI and some of the AI principles that speak to its potential, but what does it mean for governance? So Josh referred to healthcare as chaotic, and uncertainty is the major barrier to management and governance in healthcare. Payers like CMS have tried to manage this uncertainty mostly through benchmarking, but with uneven success, often due to lack of data. In 2019, CMS actually tried to establish separate benchmarks by cannulation type and indication for ECMO, but had to withdraw the proposal, due to lack of data. So I'm going to start with the conclusion, which is I think there's hope, but it requires really a different approach to management based on principles of what is known as high reliability. It comes out of the patient safety and sort of safety literature in general, but it's a basic set of principles for how one manages uncertainty. So the 5 principles are sensitivity operations, which really means that people at the front line are your best source of information about what's actually happening. Reluctance to simplify, which means you have to embrace the complexity and not simplify in the way that Shelley was describing. The 3rd principle is preoccupation with failure, which means first that you have to have an expectation of what you expect the system to do and how you expect the system to perform. And when the system doesn't perform that way, you jump on it and you try to figure out why. Deference to expertise is an interesting concept in AI because often the expert is the AI itself. It's the sort of the keeper of the accumulated wisdom. But the idea here is that experts are really good at pattern recognition, really good at knowing kind of those pre-probabilities, and they don't have to think about it too much. They can just act. And the last one is my favorite, practicing resilience, which means you should actually try to break the system sometimes just to see how it responds, and that's how you learn. Okay, but that's where we want to be. Where are we now? So it's still a significant barrier. Our current approach is still based on mostly a fee-for-service kind of a system. And so how we're treating AI is basically like it's as if it was a person or if it was a device, and we reimburse AI based on its expected utility in terms of improved patient outcomes. So we have CPT codes and things like that for AI approved algorithms. However, this requires a lot of data. I don't know how you would distinguish the sort of the marginal contributions of multiple AI systems operating in the same environment. Government really doesn't want to pay for AI that just provides a market advantage to providers, but really only the AI that contributes to improve patient outcomes. But how you would distinguish those things in a very complex environment, it seems like a very problematic approach. We're experimenting with value-based purchasing principles. We're doing bundled payments, we're generating episodes. AI has a role here as a potential tool to reduce uncertainty basically through more predictable pathways, either over the lifespan or over the care journey. So there's some potential there for AI to help with more successful bundled payments. We have accountable care, which is another model that's under experimentation, some success, and AI, I think, has a role there as a tool for phenotyping, establishing trajectories that could help reduce the uncertainty in sort of those lifetime and care journey projections. However, ultimately, value-based purchasing isn't really very logical. It doesn't really make sense to take resources from underperforming, under-resourced environments, transfer them to overperforming, over-resourced environments, and somehow expect that the under-resourced environments are going to improve. You wouldn't do that in education. You wouldn't take resources away from students that are struggling and expect that somehow they're just going to get better because they're going to try harder. So the solution to this problem is not these top-down solutions, measures and models, not these kind of meta problems of value-based purchasing. So what do we do? So Shelley touched on the fact that trust is a big part of this. And there's a lot of reasons why the algorithms that we're developing might be biased in the sense that they might work a whole lot better on one population, typically the one that we trained on, versus another population, typically the one that we're actually implementing the model on. So how can we approach this problem? How can we establish better trust? So Shelley mentioned transparency. We can create these labels that are becoming more standardized to say where the model was trained and what the data was that it was trained on. We can certainly test across all of these different factors to see that the model performs well, but you're never going to be able to test in every sort of environment. You can monitor over time to make sure that the model is performing as expected in very selective ways. You can take advantage of the fact, where there's sort of known causality and you don't have to rely so much on data collection. And then you can take context into account. And that's really the way to generate trust over time. So what do we do if we don't do value-based purchasing? How do we encourage improvement in quality and outcomes? So there are other industries that have grappled with similar problems, mostly in the impact investment community, and they have principles that they apply when they do social impact investing. Payment models are primarily designed, governed, and where feasible, owned by the communities in which they're applied. And we define communities here as really, not just local geographic communities, but communities that have shared concepts, theories, tools, and instruments. Payment models add more value than they extract from the community. So that could be either sort of transforming, giving money for completely discretionary purposes and taking away some of the discretion, or at a minimum, making sure that the money stays within the community. And then finally, the financial relationship fairly balances all of the risks and returns amongst all the stakeholders, patients, frontline workers, clinicians, everyone involved in the care delivery. So these are bottom-up solutions, but very targeted in terms of their evidence, their data, their measures, and their models. And they focus on micro-solutions, these local, collaborative, learning type of models. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining this session. I hope you found it as interesting as I have. As the team have already mentioned, we've been working together on this, and I really wanted to share the reality of what we started with before things got all fancy with the resources and input of the bigger interprofessional team. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to skip my disclosures. They're my disclosures. So we've seen some really funky AI and some really cool use of data in systems that are at least accessible to healthcare, even if they're not everyone's front-facing healthcare right now. And I work at Boston Children's Hospital, just down the road, a really well-resourced institution that invests in informatics and AI-informed healthcare. But at the front line, at the bed space, this is still our ECMO anticoagulation plan. It was on paper until not that long ago. And it's got little deviations, and it's a pretty neat plan. I like it a lot. But it's not anything like the clever, intuitive decision-making in real time informed by data that you've seen during the talk today. So this is how we make decisions. There's lots of branch points. And this is literally printed out in paper, 6 pages, that sits by the bed space of the patients on ECMO. The iteration that I just showed you is iteration 4 of the Standardized Clinical Assessment and Management Plan. And for those of you who aren't aware, Standardized Clinical Assessment and Management Plans, I'm just going to call them SCAMPs from here moving forward, are basically where you take a disease or a treatment or a diagnosis, something is a starting point for the SCAMP. And no matter what else you have, if you meet that criteria for inclusion, then you go into the SCAMP. And we use evidence-based if available, but the practical reality of our workspace is that there's not that much evidence to really inform our decisions at the bedside. So often we've got a sound management plan, which was the one that I just showed you. That's what we're using at the moment. And the idea of the SCAMPs is that whoever meets inclusion criteria is either managed according to the standard or not, but either way, the outcomes of predicted outcome, everything went the way we thought, unexpected outcome, unnecessary resource utilization, that could otherwise be phrased as adverse outcome, they're all collected. And the idea is that as we deviate from the clinical practice at the bedside according to the sound management plan, maybe we did that for a reason. Maybe we were using our clinical intuition, and the deviation should inform some sort of new knowledge or innovation or iteration of the pathway down the track. And the idea is that all of that information that's captured for patients who either are managed according to the pathway that we plan or who deviate from the plan inform iterations as to how we do it next time. And the idea is also that we incorporate new learning from the literature in the time frame that we've been collecting the real patient data. And to me, as a clinician at the bedside of a complex patient population receiving complex care, this is genius. I'm happy to hear differently, by the way. Let me show you how genius translates into actuality. This is the data collection tool for up until the most recent version of SCAMP. It is also paper, printed out. Our ECMO team, I hope many of you are in the audience, dutifully filled these things out for many years, 10 years actually. There are 172 data fields on the day 1 ECMO SCAMP. I'm going to go over time, Jeff. 172 data fields on day 1. And on every day thereafter, there are these data fields that are filled in every 6 hours when we get our next set of labs. So we get labs every 6 hours. And they write in the lab values, follow the chart, which includes the practical application of the algorithm that I showed you earlier. And there's a space at the bottom of each form, I'm not kidding, we're still talking about paper-based forms, for deviations from the plan. So not just did you deviate, but why did you deviate? Can you imagine the power of this decision-making information to incorporate the reality of changes that we make in every patient every day, if we could use that to actually inform iterations of care? Unfortunately, despite the lofty goals and the absolute genius of the idea, in my opinion, this is basically the output. So we've had, I'm on the 4th iteration of our ECMO anticoagulation SCAMP. Before 2011, we collected some data, but we basically used ACTs to drive our anticoagulation. ECMO SCAMP 1 was an anti-10A derived data, anti-10A informed algorithm, and the population was almost all post-op cardiac surgery, and so coagulopathy from unmeasured factors resulted in quite a lot of bleeding. So we moved on to ECMO SCAMP 2, which was an anti-10A kind of antithrombin 3 informed model, but with the bleeding protocol. So if the patient's bleeding to death, we would potentially not continue to heparinize them. And so the introduction of the bleeding protocol was a pretty new innovation for that SCAMP. And then in the 2017-18 version 3 SCAMP, we were basically informing our decision-making with anti-10A and PTT, keeping some limits around both. And we started collecting data for TEG so that we could look back retrospectively to which parameters of TEG would make a difference for our bleeding moving forward. So they're the iterations. You can remember all of the beautiful slides from the 4 previous speakers, right? Lots of data, triggers, fantastic models. This is the statistical analysis that we get from our paper-based, typed-in data set from this really cool idea. It's not that exciting. And it's also not that informative for iterating through the different pathways. And so the information that we did iterate on, because it was still better than no information, is basically the outcomes at the bottom of each slide. So at the end of the data collection, before we introduced SCAMPs, we knew how often we changed heparin for each patient. At the end of the first SCAMP, we had a baseline for trying to stop changing heparin all the time, and how much antithrombin we used, and we'd collected enough information to know how many patients died. And then as we iterated through, you can see that our outcome metrics are not sophisticated, and they're certainly not driving active learning with each patient. Again, this is fairly standard descriptive statistics, and through no fault of any individual or plan or program, the dream never met the actuality. And so what we want to do is find a better way. This is what we're hoping for. How could AI-informed, AI-enabled SCAMPs work? So the idea now is that we've lost the paper. I can't see any of our ECMO specialists in the room. I expected somebody to cheer when I said that. The paper is gone. And instead of the individuals needing to iteratively make a change for the patients at the bedside through decision-making that isn't informed by each of the other patients, our hope and our plan is to move through to a much better targeted data extraction from the electronic health records in a vendor-agnostic way, so that this can potentially be derived at a resource-rich centre, but applied across centres without the same resources. And to use machine learning and AI models informed by human knowledge, that's us, to then iterate the next versions of the SCAMP, of the algorithm that will then inform care for the next field. And at the same time, still actively targeting the deviations from care, not for penalisation, not as a quality metric in isolation, you didn't follow the pathway, but rather as a driver for new knowledge acquisition. So that's the dream. And I wonder if any of you are interested, and even if you're not, at least hold your phone up, so I think you are. Can you click on this survey? It's a Survey Monkey. And what we're really interested in is you, as the field, as the professionals that will either believe that there is a path forward with this, or think that I'm as crazy as I sometimes sound, and help us work out where we need to target the potential for change in this space. Is this something you're interested in taking on as professionals with us? Or is this something that's pie in the sky and just belongs in Jimmy's beautiful slides?
Elliot Cohen from Nashville. Thank you for the Spectrum medical advertisement. You're talking about using the algorithms you've set up with the alarms for changing out oxygenators early. So have you significantly increased the number of oxygenator changeouts you do? And have you looked at those oxygenators microscopically to see, does it fit? Have you proved that it actually is what it is? Has there been increased patient harm by changing out oxygenators just based on that algorithm? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think that's a great question. And the answer is twofold. So first, early on when we decided we were going to embark on this, oh, and by the way, on the Spectrum thing, unfortunately, this was the strongest system out there to allow us to do this, but there are other systems out there now. So it's not just one system, and I think more will be coming, so that will be helpful. So early on when we did this, Dr. Brody asked us the exact same question. How do we know if we don't just let these go that maybe we could get by and maybe we don't need to necessarily change them out? So early on, and we started this work back in 2008 and 2012, we put down our pencils and paper and threw that out and went all paperless, both for bypass every day as well as ECMO. And early on, we let these go. And they basically did thrombose, clot off, and then we were doing the usual fire drill at the bedside to try to reestablish flow. That being said, early on, we also took all of these oxygenators that we changed out, and we let them go pretty far, unfortunately, before we changed them out. And we took them apart, and we sent them for electron microscopy and tried to figure out exactly what was in the oxygenators and what was going on. And we realized there's a whole host of things. So we were confident that our algorithm for when to change out was appropriate. And the other thing we did is we developed an algorithm that brings the whole team in. So before we change out an oxygenator, we then move to an algorithm and run down, should we be changing out this membrane lung or not? And Dr. Agastran and Dr. Brody were very instrumental in helping us put together a systematic way of saying, is this an appropriate change out or is it not? So I don't think we change out more oxygenators than we need to, but we do see a lot of thrombosis in our oxygenators, and I think that's with going to lower heparin strategies. So I just used a very basic example of how we use the technology and the AI, but I think that coupling some of this with a lot of Josh's work, I think we're going to be able to really embark on ways that we can take care of folks better, even on a day-to-day basis, not just necessarily an oxygenator changeout. Oxygenator changeouts were actually pretty easy, right? If you thrombose it and it stops flowing and there's thrombus everywhere, that's an easy one. You can kind of hit you over the head with a hammer and say you better change that. But we're getting into some real fine nuances here because of all the data that we're collecting, thousands and thousands of bits of data a day, and we're collecting that every second, and we run a whole bunch of studies with it. But I think it's going to take a lot more people getting involved and guys like Josh to help us figure out exactly what to do with this data.
Might as well hold the mic. Jonathan Schwartz, I'm an intensivist at Stony Brook, New York. Fantastic talks. Kind of a question that you were already partly addressing, besides Spectrum medical equipment or some of the other suppliers, is what does the data collection platform look like, or what do you envision will be challenges for a lot of centers? What did it maybe look like, at your institution for, I guess the term is, data engineering? How do we actually grab the data from all these disparate platforms without having to overhaul everything, go to Spectrum Medical? And how does that relate to latency issues potentially of, shuttling all that data, sending it to some machine and then sending these real-time notifications? Have you encountered any issues with delays or things along those lines?
Yeah, I think another great question. Thank you for the question. Certainly how we take the data, how we get it, and then how we process it, all is meaningful. So being able to take that data as it's happening, second to second, bring it into a central system. So one of the things that's required for that, of course, is a robust informatics system that does the data analysis and then has the ability to stream that data back down to us. Spectrum has helped us with the development of that. We've worked with them for many years. There's certainly other systems. If you saw the Talus system down at our vendor session, they have a pretty impressive system too. This particular system that we use is a robust data acquisition system that sits on a hospital-based server, so it's all secured, right? I log into that every day through a VPN, so through a secure network, and that allows us to analyze that data and then send it back down to the bedside to our caregivers. So most of this stuff happens in fractions of a second. But yes, you do have to build the system, you have to put it in there, you have to work with IT to make sure that it's secure. There are many steps along the way, and we still struggle with some of the steps and securing some of the data and how fast we move things around and overloading systems and things like that. So we do have struggles, and like I said, I think we're really in its infancy on how we'll use this data to help us care for folks.
Good afternoon, Samir Shah from Labana Children's Hospital. First of all, thank you so much. This is a very much needed subject that needs to be addressed, and I'm sure we'll see more of this in the future. This is a question to the entire panel, and what we generally struggle with is the signal versus noise kind of feature when you have so many data points and so many, notifications that actually go to different individuals. My question is, how do you manage that, and how do you work with your team in order to make sure that it doesn't become alert fatigue? And then the second question is, have we shown a change in morbidity or mortality with the application of these AI principles? I'd be really curious to hear that.
Okay, I guess I'm up again. Sorry. I'll be brief this time with this answer. So yeah, I think alarm fatigue, and it was one thing I mentioned in my talk, it's a big issue for us, right? So one of the things that we've been able to do, and by the way, when I say we, this is very simple. This is probably the easiest thing I've ever done in my 33-year career. I've made an entire career out of hiring people that are smarter than me and letting them run with the ball. So I get to come up here and get all the accolades, but it's my team that makes all this happen, right? I'm pretty much a plug it in, turn it on kind of guy. But what we do is we take alarms and we couple them. So if A, B, and C happens, it's really difficult for that to be a false alarm. So we've taken single alarms, which are just quick notifications. The other thing we've done is we've timed alarms. So we take a thing, like you noticed in my example, the blood pressure was below 60, but it needed to be sustained there for more than a minute before we got an alert. So that if somebody's drawing a gas or changing a line or moving a stopcock, those are usually things that take place in less than a minute, so we really reduce false alarms. The other thing we've done is we removed redundancy. So Ken Fung from Columbia gave a great paper a couple years ago where he took 36 bedside alarms with our system and brought it down to 7 alarms that covered all of those 36 things. So I think it's really important. It's a national patient safety goal, right? So it's really important that we reduce alarm fatigue. The other thing the system allows us to do is we can separate alarms remotely from what happens at the bedside. So if we don't think they're critical alarms at the bedside, we do not let them take place at the bedside, but we still send them to us as we're remotely monitoring so that we can learn from these things.
I think that you've come right to the heart of the matter. How do you decide where to put the line? And it was one of the first discussions that we had with the analysts, do you remember? And I don't think there is a straightforward answer to the question. I think that asking the question and having the discussion will inform where we land on this. Also kind of as we iterate with the data. I have seen data that's not yet published out of a big system where they randomized ICUs within their system to receive an alert as a clinical decision support tool and no package versus an alert with a package of care intervention, including increasing frequency of observations and I'm not sure. There were a list of things that were used as an intervention associated with the alert. And they showed in the ICUs that were block randomized to receiving the package of the alert plus package that they've reduced mortality. And when that comes out, I think that when that study is actually fully published and vetted, it would be really neat to start thinking that through. Because I think you're right, that's the next stage, isn't it? An alert is fine, informed by risk prediction modeling, but an alert plus package that makes a difference. And then how do we iterate that alert plus package and the next steps? How do we get to the stage where we can walk down the path with multiple decision points and believe that we're informing the best decision making along the way? I've got a long answer to every question, but it's lunchtime. Thank you so much for your attention. Please reach out. My email's on everything, and I'm very happy to talk to anybody about this information, as I'm sure are Josh, Jimmy, Jeff, and Shelley. Thanks again.